Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We are going to go ahead and give folks about 1 more minute to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Well, again, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for our September Race and Education webinar on reducing suicide risks in youth of color. My name is Madeline Smith. I am the Managing Director of the Hunt Institute, a national nonpartisan nonprofit founded by 4-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt. We serve to convene people and resources to inform elected officials and policymakers, from across the aisle about key issues in education, so they are best prepared to support learners. So the Hunt Institute is also committed to having honest conversations about issues of race and culture that are embedded and impact all education across the continuum. So our Race and Education webinar series is an opportunity to provide access to people and organizations committed to improving educational outcomes for marginalized and underserved populations. In recognition of World Mental Health Day and Mental Illness Awareness Week this month of October, it is critical to understand the unique mental health risks that youth of color face. Research has shown that suicide rates are associated with adverse childhood experiences and socioeconomic factors that largely affect people of color. Furthermore, the lack of racial, ethnic, and linguistic diversity and the critical in psychologists and the critical shortage of mental health professionals in schools creates significant barriers for students to receive beneficial and culturally competent care. So that's plenty from me. I am going to go ahead and hand things over to our true experts today. We are excited to be joined by all of our speakers who will dive further into the suicide risk factors for youth of color, recommendations to address shortages in our mental health care system, and best practices for schools, peers, families, and mentors to assist youth of color in their lives who are struggling. And with that, I would like to introduce our moderator, Lauren Chikara, who will be guiding our conversation today. So with that, Lauren, I turn the floor to you.
Thanks, Madeline. Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Chikara. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the VP of School Mental Health at Active Minds. Active Minds is the leading nonprofit that is working to change the culture around mental health by mobilizing this generation of youth and young adults. Active Minds provides programs for youth and young adults that really include the tools to help ensure that mental health is valued and prioritized in their schools and communities. So thank you all for being here today. I am joined by 2 wonderful panelists, Dr. Griffin and Dr. Zamapira, and I'm going to hand it over to them for them to introduce themselves and to share a little bit about the work that they are doing to help reduce suicide risk, in youth of color. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Griffin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. And thank you to the Hunt Institute for the invitation to be on this important panel today. So my name is Dana Griffin, and I work in the School of Education at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I teach in the master's program in school counseling. I also teach in the undergraduate program that we have in human development and family science, and the doctoral program in applied developmental science and special education. I do research around school, family, community partnerships, really looking at the way that schools and families can work together to really address a variety of issues for students, but mainly around mental health and college and career readiness. So again, thank you for allowing me to be here today.
Hello, everybody. Yes, thank you to the Hunt Institute for providing this forum. Happy that everyone's here with us today. My name is Manuel Samaripa, and I come to you, I think, in several different ways. I'm currently the president of the National Latinx Psychological Association, and also the co-founder of the Institute of Chicanic Psychology and Community Wellness. It's a community-based organization. And also, I am a Dean of Counseling at Austin Community College here in Austin, Texas. And as part of my role there, we help guide, coordinate, give feedback about our behavioral intervention team. I also assist with our suicide prevention efforts and crisis response efforts as well. So I'm happy to be here with everyone.
Thank you both. So Dr. Griffin, we'll start with you. We know that students who experience adverse childhood experiences like loss, abuse, and/or family instability are at greater risk for later health concerns, including suicide. These adverse childhood experiences are often exacerbated by the systematic challenges students of color face. What are some tools or strategies that educators can use to talk to students of color about their experiences?
Yes, that's a really good question. And first, I do want to say that all youth are at high risk of suicide. It's just that low income and students of color may have less access to the resources and supports that they need. So with that, educators, number one, need to be comfortable in talking to students. It's not necessarily that we need to engage in conversation about their experiences, but just be willing to be a resource and a support for students and really let them know that we care. We need to actually not treat them based on their experiences. As an example, we talk about abuse. And so it's not an abused kid, it's a kid who may suffer abuse, but we're working with them and not just based on the experiences that they have. And we again, the number one thing that educators can do is that connection, because research shows that it can take just one adult, one supportive adult, to make the difference and to engage with students. And that's what students are looking for. They want to belong, they want to feel like someone cares about them. And so we all can take that role in ensuring that we are that person in the school. It does involve, or it means that we have to reimagine what our roles are in schools. So as teachers in the classroom, the number one role is to educate them on the subject that you're teaching, but we have to think about what students need as well, especially students of color. And sometimes making that connection outside of what we're teaching them can be key.
Great point. And it leads me to this next question, Dr. Zamaripa, that, your experience as a mental health professional working in local schools and communities, I'm sure you have observed what some of the predominant issues that students of color are facing, and particularly Latinx students are facing. But what can you name those? And can you also share a little bit about where you think these issues stem?
Thank you so much. Yes, and I want to echo what Dr. Griffin, everything that she said as well. I think that in many of our school systems, well, almost all of our school systems, some of the issues that are impacting our students are not necessarily directly related to mental health, but they impact mental health. Like, in other words, on the surface, that's not a mental health issue, but it is a wellness and well-being issue. And, one of the things we have always, and even now lately, been struggling with is just simple lack of representation in the school system. That's one of those invisible, indirect. Well, it's not invisible if you're a student of color, you understand it. But when you're not represented in the curriculum or discussed, or even not allowed to talk about your community, then that is part of fostering the sense of not belonging, as Dr. Griffin was saying. So then it weakens those bonds that the child, and the student needs to stay connected and feel a part of the larger community within the schools. So it's not just a curriculum issue, right? And as Dr. Griffin was saying, teachers have to abide by like the teaching the content, but also realize they're in this larger role. So again, from that other end, saying the same thing, curriculum, programming. I know here in Texas, we're very restrictive. They just passed a law that, no office that receives state funding in any level of education can use the words diversity or equity, and any of those offices are gone, right? So, so it's a systemic issue, and one of those aspects is just, being erased. And so in the middle of all that is that lack of connection, a lack of belonging. And I think that's one of the concrete things that we see that does impact overall well-being.
Thank you both for sharing. And I can tell you that the work that Active Minds does, we see the same thing. They just want to feel belong. They want to see themselves reflected in the programs that are being administered in school. So I really appreciate you both naming that. Just want to remind the audience members that we do have an opportunity for you to ask our panelists questions. Please submit any questions using the Q&A feature that is down on the bottom of your screen. So we know that recent research really shows that supporting schools in providing trauma-informed care is essential. Dr. Griffin, what is social emotional learning and how is it tied to trauma-informed practices?
Yes, so actually in North Carolina, social emotional learning is not a good word to use anymore, just to put that out there, because what's happening in Texas is also happening in North Carolina. Like SEL is seen as an anti-white curriculum, actually. But actually, Castle talks about SEL as having these 5 core competencies: decision-making, building relationship skills and social awareness, building self-awareness, and then self-management. Like, how do you regulate your emotions, right? Not necessarily an anti-white curriculum, but it's providing all of the students with the skills and competencies that they need to, cope with their experiences. I do want to talk about SEL as it relates to anti-racist pedagogy, because we apply SEL in this colorblind method, and what it does is it oppresses and minimizes the racialized experiences that students of color they have in school. So even though you asked about trauma-informed practices, it's really what we're moving to, and Dina Simmons talks a lot about this, is really thinking about that we have to be aware of the racialized experiences and the racism that students of color that they do experience in schools. And so really looking at ways that we don't continue to oppress, marginalize, minimize these experiences, and not overlook the stress, the trauma of the racial trauma, the racial stress that these students experience. And so that's one way that we are moving toward using SEL and tying SEL to the work that we do with our youth of color. So yes, sorry, I think I covered answered your question. Yes.
Yeah, you did. And I really appreciate the call out of what's happening across the country around SEL practices, and how just to rethink how we're approaching that work. It's still really important, but from a buzzwordy term, how can we still move within that work without maybe utilizing that those phrases, because it is so volatile. So Dr. Zamaripa, as a current dean and a previous academic program director and associate professor, how do you think educators and members of the school community can really encourage students to seek care, to advocate for their well-being, and really ensure that youth input is considered when creating best practices?
And we could figure out all those 3 pieces to that question. We'd be on a great roadmap for everything we're talking about today. But definitely there are things that a lot of us have seen, and myself, when we're talking about ways to make sure that we listen to student voices, but also to make sure that we are engaging our students in a way that makes sense for them. I wanted to say that real quickly that we're talking about belonging, and that's, I think, what I've been seeing with some of these initiatives and laws and policies that are being passed that are limiting our language. I've begun to notice that people are starting to use the ideas of purpose and belonging, right? And since we can't use some of these other words, and I think that just goes to everything that we know and what we're saying. I mean, that really is the foundation, right? And so a lot that reminds me, there's so much different research that's been done, but I'm thinking of one particular book called Subtractive Schooling by Dr. Angela Valenzuela that came out a couple of maybe 1999. And one of the things that came from that, and other people have said something similar, is this idea of caring. Students and teachers both say they care, but students and teachers usually have very different ideas of what caring means. So for teachers, a lot of the times, they see students caring about being a good student or caring about their education, usually by a lot of low context tasks like eye contact or turning in work or being attentive or being on time. And culturally, for a lot of students of color, sometimes that's a very low context, and it's not that that's not important, but that's usually not the measure of care. Where students of color see caring as students investing in some type of personal connection with the student, that they are aware that they care for the student. So teachers say, "Oh, students don't care," and students are saying teachers don't care. And they're talking about different ways of caring. So I think that's really important, is that we need to have a discussion about learning more from students about what is caring, what is success, and learning and looking more at what we're teaching our teachers, because teachers go into the field with all these ideas that we just said right here, right now. But a lot of the times, because we have so many state mandated assessments and so many very institutionalized requirements, that way of caring kind of gets taught out of the people that become teachers, and so they come out the other end with this idea of what it means to be a good teacher, and it's very different than when they started. And so I think we need to be aware that students still have that. They still have that expectation of a personal connection, and students of color as well. This is something we're talking about in general. We're much more collectivistic. We're not, and we're much more collectivistic in our interactions. And so when we talk about a context where people care, they're going to expect people to not just look at specifically tasks that they're doing, but that the teachers and the administration care about the whole student, their whole family. And I think that's crucial. I mean, especially since much of the world follows our educational system, which is built on individualism, and yet 2/3 of the world is collectivistic. So we're kind of shipping out this individualistic way of education, and mental health for that matter, to the world because they rely on us. And we're shipping that out, and it's being accepted to a collectivistic world primarily. So I think we need to think about those systemic issues because it matters to that one student. This is an example where that theory and these systemic issues can really be seen on the ground. Like, it's really clear, especially if you work with students.
Thank you for that. And along the same lines, Dr. Griffin, your research really focuses on promoting mental health and wellness in schools, especially for historically marginalized students. So kind of thinking along those same lines that Dr. Zamapira just said, what are some of the effective ways that school administrators, teachers, counselors, and other leaders can really support the well-being of a diverse student body?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know that we have a time limit on our answer. And so I will try to be very to the point. I will try, but number one, it involves a change in us. So we have to understand our own biases, and we have to own up to that and admit that we have biases, right? We all do. And that guides our interaction with students. And along with that is recognizing the language that we use. So, as an example, I hear in schools all the time that these kids are from bad neighborhoods, or we still say broken families, which I can't stand that. But the language that we use is more, it's negative language. And then again, it feeds into our biases and, good neighborhood, bad neighborhood, broken family, intact family, like all of those type of things. And that's just two examples of the way that we do that. So we need to change our language. We need to understand our biases, own up to our biases. But we also need to advocate. We have to jump into advocacy to do our role. And, as a school counselor, I tell my students that your role is no longer in your office. Like, your role is doing work in the communities, is coming outside of your office. It's advocating for removal of oppressive practices and policies. Zero tolerance is one example. Like, that hurts and harms our students in more ways than it starts the school to prison pipeline. Know your students. We talking about caring, like, we have to get to know our students outside of what they're doing in their classroom. Like, this isn't the top student or bad student. Like, know your students separate from that. And then we do have to engage in these anti-racist practices as well. And be aware of the data. Like, what is the data in your school telling you? We often ignore that. So disproportionality is a thing. It exists. Behavioral referrals, who's being referred? It's Black and brown students. It's Black females, right? Those are the ones that are being referred. And often for non-violent type of activities, it's for the way that they express their displeasure, the way that they express their anger. It's for being loud, right? Which is part of a cultural norm. We're loud, we're expressive. Look, I'm talking with my hands, right? I'm not angry. It's just the way that I communicate. So even understanding differences in communication styles. But behavioral referrals, look at our gifted ed placement. Who's in our AP, in our gifted programs? Who's being funneled into those programs? Who's being funneled into special education? The data doesn't lie, but we choose to ignore it. And that is another disservice. And all of these things together equals the racial trauma that students are experiencing in schools. And we are like perpetuating the cycle. And so those are some of the things. And if you will allow me the liberty to tell just a little story, we need more people of color in the schools. We need more Black and brown teachers and counselors. Counseling is a white profession. The majority of counselors are white, middle class, female, professionals. And I work with teachers, teacher interns in addition to my students. And one of the teachers told me a story. So this is a Latina female, and she told the story of this, she's in elementary school, and she told the story of this third grader coming to her and just giving her a hug every day. She doesn't teach the student. She doesn't know the student. She doesn't even know the student's name, right? But one of the things that she can do, she can communicate in Spanish with the student, right? And she looks like the student. And that was the connection. Like, this student finally found someone in the school who could, this person could relate to and who could communicate. And that makes the difference. And so we need to do a better job of trying to make sure that we diversify our education system. And so that's something that we need to do more on a policy level. There are a lot of barriers within that, like we need to increase pay, we need, a better system, but I guess, sure, those are all of the things that we need. It makes a difference. And another personal story, I'm sorry. I have a Black son, and he's in high school and had his first Black male teacher. My son is like, I always ask, how's school going? What's happening in school? I get very minimal responses, as teenagers can do. But he had this one Black male teacher in an African-American class. He would come home and tell me everything that they talked about. It was such joy to see that in his learning, that, this teacher recognized him, could connect with him. They were learning about information that was relevant to them. And we don't do a good enough job of that as well. And so that's another way that we can support the well-being of students too, with our curriculum, diversifying the curriculum as well. So it's a lot of policy changes that need to happen in addition to what we need to be doing inside the school as well. So thank you for that leeway with this.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Griffin. You hit on so many important points because it comes from a variety of different places and lots to think about. And I think we probably could have had an entire webinar just about what you had just shared, because there's just so much to unpack there. But speaking of well, before we go into the next question, I just want to remind folks to add in some questions in the Q&A. Hopefully, you're sparked with some wonderings as you just heard Dr. Griffin's response to that last question. But Dr. Zamapir, thinking about policy, what role do policymakers really play in confronting some of these issues? And how do school administrators, school board members play a role in this as well?
I mean, crucial foundational roles, because, we have seen over the last 100 years, really, so I'm getting older, I was going to say the last 30 years, but maybe it's the last 50 years at least. Okay. The evolution of for example, what an independent school district looks like, or consolidated independent school district, depending on your state. We say those words and we know them, but, the reason, those communities, use those words is because to some degree they were supposed to be community informed, right? And the more that we have larger oversight, the more that is shifting. Now, that's not necessarily the issue, good or bad. The issue is, because we have more oversight about what our schools look like, what we can teach in them, what does it mean to be a teacher, and the continuing discussion of what even, about school violence, that's also one of the things that we respond to a lot at the community college level, and others is, threat assessment, school violence. So now, arming teachers, having teachers in the classroom, the degree to which there need to be more police, when of course we've been calling for more mental health professionals, and that's not really being heeded as often. So all of these decisions are more and more, having the final word at a state level or school board level. And so those people need to really understand, as Dr. Griffin is saying, the data. And behind the data are stories, as Dr. Griffin was sharing. And we know that policymakers and school board members respond to stories because that's human nature. But the stories are also there because people will be like, well, it's just the data and we don't sell the data. Well, we need to find ways to show what the data is talking about. And we need to have people that are informed. I think we're seeing more of a tendency for a lot of different reasons are people getting appointed to school boards more and more because of, because they're friends of the governor, they're friends of whoever, which has always happened, but we're seeing it more. And we're seeing more people in charge of educational policy that do not have an education background. And we have to be, these are like code words, and these are like these underlying invisible systemic methods, because people they rationalize that by saying, well, we don't want people just from educational systems, we want people outside. That only works if the outside people are also critical thinkers and want to be informed, right? Or they just they're an informed citizenry. So we need to be attentive. School board elections are so much more important than presidential elections, even, I would say. School board elections are crucial. Who's on the school board? So they're the ones that come in with ideas of how they want to make schools different and better. And that's informed by the narrative that's being put out. And a lot of times that narrative really still blames a lot of students of color. They're about, it's the students of color that are negatively impacting schools. And so we need to be careful about those narratives. We need to really do our own internal work, as Dr. Griffin was also saying. We all have biases. And so we need to explore our own advocacy. We need to explore our own voice. We need to make sure that that voice is used. As we've been saying, being a part of our students' lives is also now requiring being an advocate. And I'll share, that our middle son, very brown, very dark, struggled with a lot of anxiety, so very flat affect, so looked very, menacing to people. He got in trouble in middle school, and of course, the first thing they wanted to do was send him to the alternative school. They have different names for different, right? And that's school to prison pipeline right there. And what parents don't know is you can just say no. And the administration acts as if you have to do it. And a lot of our parents don't understand the system, and they'll, as much as they disagree, they'll do what administration says. And we just said no. I mean, we're not going to. What are you going to do? Rack up the absences until we. So of course he was lucky enough to have parents that were a little informed. So side note, we fought that. We understood advocacy. We got some other people involved, but parents need to know that they have a voice. And the administration, if you see some discrepancy or some bias there, you can wait, stop the process, and figure out what is best for your child. And usually going straight to alternative school is not, because that's what the kids want. I mean, our son wanted to go there. Like, that's where his friends were. Like, it gets them out of this environment already, and they're hoping that might be better. And don't believe the story that once you go there, the kids like it because there's pride and structure and discipline. And that is also, that is a symptom. I mean, kids are going in there with a lot of different issues, mental health issues, stressors. And of course, if they're, if all their environment is just focused on providing some structure, you can relax into that. But that is not a solution. Just because a child likes the taste of sugar doesn't mean it's good for them, right? I mean, so that is also a false narrative, that, oh, it's good for them because they have structure and discipline and they like it. That just says that the mainstream school system, obviously it has a lot to work on. So I'm going to stop. I don't know if I exactly answered the question.
No, that was great. And I appreciate that, you also centered not only our policymakers and how important school board members are in this policy realm, but also how parents and guardians can utilize their voice and push back and advocate for the right kinds of programs or resources that will really support the whole child. So I appreciate that. So these next questions are for both of you. So Dr. Griffin, we'll start with you. What are some of the best resources that students of color who are struggling with their mental health can easily access? And, what additional resources must be implemented in schools and communities to really help reduce the suicide risk of youth in color in particular?
Mm-hmm. I love this question because this is, my focus on the community involvement and working with families. I feel like going out into the communities and raising awareness is more important, or just as important, than the research that we're doing, right? And so one of the things that I'm doing right now is that, the research that I write and publish, the people who need it is not accessible to them. And so they're not getting the information. And so it's important that we raise awareness, like go to Black churches, go to faith-based institutions and talk about this, have panels on this. I'm really big on working with parents because I know that in the Black community, it may be something that is overlooked, or, it could be like, rely on your faith, like pray, you need to have a stronger faith. And, that's not going to cut it, right? That's not, we need more than that. Faith is big. I'm a faith-based person, but we need more than that. And so really building these partnerships with families, helping them understand the the way that it could be, the behavior is manifested. And so, we talk about that, the anger or the acting out, people think is a behavioral problem, but in students of color, it could be the way that they're showing that, these are some suicidal thoughts that we may be having. So even, recognizing that and just raising awareness to that, having conversations with people. I work with Black families at my son's high school, and, we have meetings every month. And the first thing that we did, mental health, right? Looking at mental health in our families, in our Black youth. So that's one way to do that. And then as far as resources, there are actually a ton of resources for Black and Brown. And I also want to bring in the intersectionality. Like, we're talking about Black and Brown, but we also have to think about those who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, right? That suicide is on the rise in that population as well. And so we have to think about that too. But the common ones, we have 988, the crisis line, the suicide line. I love the resources from SAMHSA and NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental, sorry, I forgot. I can't even think what the I is, but I love those resources. But if you even just search like mental health resources for students of color, there are a ton of resources that will come up that will be useful, that people can rely on. And then the number one thing that I feel that is needed is that we need to have affinity caucus groups in schools, because these are the groups where people can come together and really talk about the things that they are experiencing and have a support group within the schools as well. It is something that a lot of people may think that is excluding the white population, but we have to admit again that students of color experience racial trauma. There's things that are happening in the school that they experience that we don't want to have to explain. Like, taking the time to explain what we're going through and get people to understand takes away from the time that we can focus on others' experiences and what they're going through, and then come up with ways to address that. And so, having that student voice in those affinity caucus meetings is something that could be very beneficial. And it's something that all of us can do, regardless of your training, because it's really about listening to the students, hearing the students, understanding the students, giving them that voice. So that is something that we all can do as well.
Thank you for sharing. That was fantastic. Yeah, I think we talk about it a lot here. I think, in the professional world, those of us that do this research and this work, and we've been talking about that very idea that we need to go to the community. The community doesn't understand what we're doing, it's not going to be impactful. One of the things that we know with students of color, I'm pretty sure with most students of color, I know for the Latinx population, and this also has to do with generational issues of generations in this country. But a lot of our parents get kind of the rap that, oh, it's hard to get, Latino parents involved because they won't come to school, they don't care. So then the implication is they don't care, right? But they're hard. Well, one we know is that almost all students of color have a lot of parents that need to work at a certain level. So, they don't have that free time. But two, a lot of parents in our community have a very, again, different notion. What are notions of education and systems? So a lot of our parents feel like, I trust the school, I send my kids to you, so from this time to this time, you do your job. Now, if you're calling me because something's going on and you're having a problem, then now I have to do your job too. It's just a different framework. They don't see it as like, and of course they care about what's going on with their kids, but the initial entry to hearing that is not necessarily, oh, okay, great, I'm glad you're reaching out to me, let me help my kid. It's like, well, I'm here doing my job as a parent. When they come here, I'm going to do my job. I'm trusting you for all these 8 or 9 hours to do your job. You're saying you're going to take care of them, you're going to educate them, do all this stuff, and now you're calling me. Now I have to make time. So that's an initial obstacle. Parents think like it's so it's not that they're resisting, like they don't want to come in. It's just, it's a whole different way of thinking about what educational systems mean and what are people's lanes, what we know for our kids is the more acculturated they become, in other words, because that's always seen as the goal, like the more they go from, adopting more and more of the mainstream US values, the worse for our kids, especially the worse their mental health gets, right? And we know we have this quote unquote paradox, is that on the one hand, we see more traditional cultural and social norms of Latinx families as kind of being an obstacle, but really more and more research is coming out that is what gives them hope. That's what gives them connection. And if the school and everybody's saying to leave those behind, then again, an invisible indirect consequence is that they leave that behind to be successful. And then all of a sudden you have mental health issues rising because they don't have that anchor, right? It's very like basic mental health 101 for the counselors around, is like, if somebody has something that they're struggling with in a different conversation, and you just tell them to let that go, but you don't feel anything healthy with that, then they're kind of lost, right? So when you have something that's very important to students, like cultural ways of knowing that make them feel connected, and they're getting the message directly or indirectly that that's not okay, what connections are you? We're not filling that with any other connections. One, we shouldn't. And so, but then they're kind of left and they feel more isolated. Again, no sense of belonging, lack of connection, right? And so I think one of the things we need to do is really center or decenter, actually, more Western individualistic ways of what it means to be well, what it means to be educated, what it means to be successful. And there's room for that. We have this idea that knowledge is this pie that's very limited, because then we have the feedback, oh, well, now, we're changing the whole American educational system. Well, one, yes, because societies change and they shift. That's always going to happen. And two, it doesn't have to be, as Dr. Griffin was saying, like it's not necessarily anti, it's just more inclusive. We got to, again, think about, what do we mean by exclusion and inclusion? Because when we're hearing like, oh, that's excluding white families or white voices, if you have some of these affinity group discussions, as you were saying, Dr. Griffin, well, if you don't have them, and you automatically don't consider communities of color, you say, okay, we're opening it up to everybody. Well, then communities of color are not going to feel safe. So in the name of inclusion, you're actually still excluding, right? So what does inclusion really mean? What does exclusion really mean? If you're thinking about it from a dominant perspective of people that have always been kind of in power, then their idea of exclusion is going to be very different than people that have already been excluded. So just some thoughts.
Can I add on before you go to the, okay. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I love what you said about the parenting piece. And one of the things too that we often overlook is that, they want parents to come into the school and help out, but then it's, I want you to come to the school and do as I say, right? I want you to fix the problem in the way that I see it can be fixed. And the parents aren't even heard, and their values and their beliefs and their intellect that they have on their kids is overlooked because it goes against, right, the culture of the school. And so, that's a problem as well. And, and part of my job, like I place students in different schools around, North Carolina for their internship. And when I go into the schools, they see my Blackness. They don't know who I am. They don't see Dr. Griffin, right? They don't know what I do. And even the treatment, like I notice, and I'm very mindful, and are they greeting me? Do they greet me with a smile? The welcoming piece is not there in schools. Like they want us to come fix it, but they don't want us in schools. They truly don't, for the most part. And so that's always a problem too. And you can feel that. It's in what's not said, is in the body language. Like that's a problem too. And so even thinking about, I know we're talking about teachers or counselors, you got to think about your support staff too, like who's in the front office and how welcoming are they? When parents even enter the building, can it communicate with parents, right? And so that's a piece as well. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to add that too, with that parent involvement. It's like parents are, not involved, parents of color, they don't care. but you don't want us there. You truly don't want to hear what we have to say. That's the message that parents get. So.
Thank you both. Great responses, lots to think about, and really lots for our system folks in those leadership roles to really think about unpacking and actually changing the narrative of really what we can do to support the health and well-being of our youth, because they're getting a lot thrown at them, and they really, I like what was said earlier, you know, we have to think about the whole child, the whole school, the whole community, right? And what are we doing to give all of those layers, the resources that they are all effectively making changes in their communities to support youth mental health. Dr. Griffin, I want to go back to what you shared about social emotional learning, and we got a question just asking if you could provide a little bit more context around some of the political nature that we're seeing around SEL, and if you have seen other communities or states or school districts pivot and what language they're using that's not SEL.
Yeah. It's a very political time right now in North Carolina. So they just, North Carolina has adopted these Parent Bill of Rights, and the Parent Bill of Rights, basically, you know, they're saying that, you know, I don't want you talking to my kids about SEL because it's anti-white. I don't want you talking about diversity and inclusion with my kids. And so schools are right now struggling how to interpret that. Some schools are taking it very literally. It's like, you can't do it. We're not having it. You can't even do mental health assessments, like not just social emotional learning, not just diversity and inclusion, but also in assessing mental health. And so we are to really think about doing suicide prevention in schools. We have to be able to administer, you know, surveys, instruments. We have to assess students' mental health, but even that has been blocked with the Parent Bill of Rights. And so we are currently navigating how to do this work and how to I don't want to say work around. Although I know I'm on this webinar, I do tell my students to work inside the box, but work outside the box. But you didn't hear me say that. But so we don't use that language. We do talk about, you know, how to deal with, you know, we use generic language, you know, how to handle emotions, or, you know, how to, you know, I don't know what we're doing, you know, how to handle emotions. We talk about, you know, character traits, like those type of things. And we try to do the work within what is currently acceptable so that we can in some way or shape or form try to at least be a resource for students in the school. So we're still learning and still trying out new ways to think about how to do this work without actually using SEL, mentioning SEL, using the SEL framework, but, you know, making good decisions. You know, we try to stay, you know, if we don't say SEL and we talk about decision makings, how do we make great decision as far as college and career? Like that's more acceptable, you know, I think, but that's the way that we're trying to do it, but it's new to us. It's just been implemented for this year, and we're really running into a lot of barriers. And so, you know, even my students are, you know, in the schools, they come back to us and they're like, Dr. Griffin, the things that you're telling us to do in the classroom, we're not allowed to do in the schools. And it's actually pretty sad because SEL benefits everyone. It's not just for students of color. It benefits everyone in the school. And, you know, thinking about, you know, what we need, what do we see our adults doing? Can they even engage in conversations, respectful conversations? Like it's teaching how to have disagreements and do it in a respectful manner and listen to people and hear both sides of the coin. But yes. So I don't know if I'm answering the question of the participant because this is new and we are still trying to navigate how to do this work with the barriers that we now have before us.
Thank you, Dr. Griffin. And I can share that North Carolina isn't the only state sort of like new to this. We've seen this across the country. A lot of other states are navigating this. And I think we're all trying to learn from each other and kind of understand the sweet spot and the right kind of language to still move that needle and still be able to affect change and support our youth. Dr. Zamarifa, you mentioned earlier that there are lots of things that affect youth mental health, right? And it's not just, we can't just talk about mental health sort of like in this vacuum, right? So really, what do you think is attributing to the rise in anxiety and other mental health concerns of our youth of color? And really, what have you seen on a national scale been proposed to really help address these concerns?
Good question. Of course, I'll start by answering the last one, which is, we don't really see anything on a large national scale that is truly addressing the rise that we're seeing in this anxiety and mental health issues. There has never been a comprehensive approach, procedure, or policy to address even mental health. When I started professional, I guess, career 20 something years ago, for a while, a lot of my job was also teaching students that wanted to be school counselors, like Dr. Griffin. And even then until now, we're fighting to talk about mental health and the need to respond to mental health issues in general, and students of color in particular. This is, I think, in some of the answers to the question, the first part of the question really is multi-layered. And if we look at it, if we step back and look, we can see how they're all connected. But if we look closely, they seem like they're coming from all over the place. One, we have our kids that are subjected to a lot more information than ever before. Their phones, YouTube, and we talk about this all the time, but it's really difficult to monitor, and we know our kids are being more and more exposed to content that really it's hard for them to developmentally process. This shouldn't happen. We also know that a lot of this content, directly or indirectly, a lot of the times still contain a lot of racist messages, a lot of homophobic messages. They include a lot of messages that kids are getting directly and processing with each other. And so that's one thing. Second, over the last 8 years, 10 years, maybe more, we have seen much more direct racist ideology, more out in the open, that's being filtered. Teachers are being handcuffed with what they can say to address that. So now that's on the rise, and now teachers can address it with inclusive curriculum. So the students are just left there. So we see that happening. With that, we see the increase in violence against communities of color. We've seen that just because we're not talking about it as much, we still have the issue of police violence in communities of color. And for Latinx population, we're still with, we're still dealing with kids caged at the border, with increased ICE deportation. So we know already that over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been consistent small pockets of research where third graders, first graders, second graders had developed anxiety about whether their parents will be home when they get home or not. And these are for even students that are citizens, right? That so we have a lot of these societal issues. And then you couple that with, as Dr. Griffin was saying, we're not even allowed to facilitate programs or ways that we can even disagree in a constructive way. So So we have a lot of these systemic societal issues that impact the student. They don't feel that they can talk, and when they are talking, they're not talking to trusted adults. Um, they continue to kind of talk with each other, and that helps misinformation to happen about many of the things that they're encountering. We see the rise in bullying, and that's top. So that's students of all backgrounds, but particularly with students of color, and then even more so, LGBTQIA students of color, right? So we're starting to see, as we're becoming more aware as a society of differing identities and intersecting identities, our society hasn't caught up on how to actually be welcoming and respond to that. So I think we are at this place where we are needing to reckon with that, and we're going to need to decide what we're going to do from this point forward.
Thank you for that response. This is our last question. I know we're running out of time. We could spend probably another few hours or days even unpacking all of this. But Dr. Griffin, one of the things that we know is that not all educators have the capacity to really meet the needs of students of color, right? And so, what can folks in school settings that may have restrictive policies or practices in place, where can those folks really go to seek more of a peer-to-peer support approach so they can remain allies and educators for youth of color?
Yes, that's a great question. And I also want to say too that knowing many teachers, that I understand how difficult it is being in the school system right now, and the stress that a lot of people are under. And coming from the pandemic, all of us dealt with stress and anxiety and fear and grief, right? And trauma. We all, for the first time, we all have this unified trauma that we all experience that's still playing out today. I'm a huge believer. I'm a lifelong learner. And so, like, I'm on this panel today. I do not see myself as an expert in this. And I'm always striving to learn more, read more, professional development. And to me, that is the key, is that once you graduate from your program, once you're in the field, that we still have to continue to go and get trainings. And so I would, really refer people to professional, go to conferences and go to workshops, webinars, to learn more about things that they can do. But in the school systems, support groups, affinity caucuses can happen in the school system as well. It takes effort, it's time, it's outside of the work hours. And I know that that's a lot to ask with everything that's going on and all of the time and energy. But for those who are truly invested and truly want to see change and truly want to be a resource and support for the students, these are things that we need to do, right? And so having the support group in the schools is one way to do it. You have people who are from the school, who know the community, who know the students, and you all invested and making sure that you're there for your students. I think that's one way. And I'm trying to be fast with the time so that I don't monopolize. So I'm sorry.
No, that's great, Dr. Griffin. And we only have a couple more minutes, so I think you answered that question really well. So thank you both, Dr. Griffin and Dr. Zamaripa, for being here today. I think we talked a lot about ensuring that our youth of color feel like they belong, that we have resources and policies that are reflective of that belonging and what we need to really do to move that needle, to ensure that they are comfortable to actually approach an adult that is willing to be able to be a resource for them. And that these personal connections really do go a long way. And I think that probably is the biggest takeaway, that you can have all these policies, you can have all these programs, but that personal connection that our youth are really having with what I like to call our youth champions, our educators, our bus drivers, our cafeteria folks, that any trusted adult in their lives, that they have these connections with them. They feel more connected, belonging in those communities, and more really open to seeking the resources that they need to ensure that they're supporting their mental health, and actually decreasing their risk of suicide. So thank you both again. The webinar will be uploaded to the Hunt Institute's YouTube site. Our next conversation around race and education webinar will be a conversation with the authors of Stay and Prevail. Students of color don't need to leave their communities to succeed. And that will be hosted on November 14th at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.